Welcome to the Self-Carapist Podcast. Join me, Lorain Moorehead, a licensed psychotherapist, clinical supervisor, and EMDR consultant, along with expert guests as we explore the approaches and modalities we've used and developed to support our clients' success. Our conversations and stories are designed to inspire new and seasoned clinicians to stay curious, prioritize self-care, and never stop learning. Today's guest, Patricia Dobratz, started out prosecuting domestic violence cases before transitioning to a career in marriage and family therapy. Now she combines her legal and clinical prowess. She, as well as her business, Clinical Best Practice Institute, are becoming familiar names to clinicians and practices throughout Arizona and beyond, and are known for helping clinicians bridge the gap between regulations and ethical practice with proper support. In this episode, we discuss ethical considerations to marketing, the evolution of the field, what to look for as a supervisor or supervisee entering a supervisory relationship, as well as building a practice that avoids burnout. Hi, Patty. Welcome to the Self-Carapist Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited. Your background is that you started in the legal profession, and you were prosecuting DV perpetrators. Is that correct?
Yep. That was supposed to be my dream job. I got that right out of law school, and started, prosecuting domestic violence cases for the most part, and did that for a couple of years before making the switch.
How did you decide what to switch to and why?
So when I was in law school, I actually had a passion for social work. Psychology was one of my undergrad majors. And so I always had kind of the passion for the helping profession. And it would have paired nicely with working in the field of domestic violence. And so I had actually looked at some joint degree programs, didn't go that route. And then while I was working my first couple of years, my dad was actually really, really sick. And I remember as he was getting sicker, just kind of thinking back, reflecting on his life, and he was a teacher, and he liked teaching, but sports were his passion. And so I just started thinking about how I wasn't loving what I was doing. I think it's a really flawed system, especially when we talk about domestic violence. And so it didn't feel like I had wanted it to feel. So I just started thinking, I was like, I don't want to look back on my life and wish I had done something different. So started looking into different, career paths, different master's programs, and found the marriage and family therapy program and thought, okay, well, I can help families probably in a different way. And then figured out eventually that I could combine those two brains somehow, and here I am.
That's so interesting. I think one of the reasons that what you do is so cool to me is because I wanted to do both also. I remember having a debate with my friends and family. Should I go law or should I go psychology? And then my first internship was at the state hospital, and I worked with those who were sentenced to be there, and they'd have lawyers that would come to their hearings. And I thought, well, maybe it's that. Maybe that is a neat combination.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I think it makes a lot of sense, especially when you are sort of advocating for victims like you were in some capacity, that it might feel like there was more to be done in the background.
Absolutely. And I think, for me at least, I just felt like I was stuck in what I was able to do in that system, whereas behavioral health and looking into it, I have more discretion and more flexibility, and felt like, I could kind of create that path differently and really tailor to the victims or the families or the people I was working with in a way that supported them versus kind of a one-size-fits-all.
And you really have done that. It feels like you've paved and developed a path that maybe hasn't been traveled before. So even more so of designing exactly how you want to show up.
Absolutely. Yeah. I knew when I entered the master's program for marriage and family therapy that I would combine the legal brain and the clinical brain. I just didn't know how. And then as I got into the behavioral health world, just seeing kind of this gap of support for clinicians, I was like, okay, now I can create something new, right?
Yeah. What are some of the things that you have created to answer that calling?
I think one thing that I found while serving on the Board of Behavioral Health Examiners, right? So it regulates all Arizona behavioral health licenses. And so, that helped me. The regulatory hat kind of incorporated the legal brain and ethics. And what I found was so many clinicians getting themselves into binds, not because they were malicious or ill-intended, but just didn't necessarily understand the regulatory world. And so trying to bridge that gap between regulations, ethical practice, and being able to still provide quality clinical services. And there just wasn't anybody out there supporting clinicians in that way. And so wanted to find a way to do quality trainings to bridge that gap, being able to do ethics consultations. So when clinicians, something doesn't feel right, they have a place to turn and walk through that ethical decision-making process. And then supervision, really finding ways to support supervisors. I found that to be another kind of missing piece. And so being able to create consultation groups and support for supervisors, those are probably the three main ways that I've been able to, at least I hope, provide support that wasn't there before.
Yeah. You make a great point that I think as clinicians are learning about potential pitfalls in the profession, it feels like they're purposeful. Like, well, I know not to do this, and so I'm deciding not to. We're kind of looking for the purposeful violations, like, oh, you knew not to do that and you deliberately did it, versus, wow, I just really didn't know that was a law. I didn't know how I overstepped it, and now my license is in jeopardy because of it, or now I'm reporting to the board because of it.
Yeah, I think there's such a wide spectrum of potential violations or risks out there that people, to your point, don't consider, right? We see the extremes and we know I would never do that. We don't think about kind of how things can snowball or what else could be considered a violation or a concern. And a lot of things fly under the radar until you don't know they're a problem until they're a problem, right? And so how do we start thinking proactively about some of those gray areas? And hopefully I'm helping some clinicians do that so they don't find themselves in those binds.
Yeah. Can you give some examples of common gray areas or some of the most common examples of this that you've seen?
I think one of the biggest ones that clinicians don't necessarily think about are conflicts of interest when treating multiple members of a system, whatever that may be, right? Like multiple family members or referrals of a friend or coworkers. And we love referrals, right? And you want clients to refer to you. But there becomes this potential for a bias or skewed view if you're hearing about a client from another client's perspective, right? And then you're sitting in the therapy room giving feedback to a client based on these other things that you've heard that they may not know that you've heard, or that, again, are just another perspective. And so I think clinicians get themselves into binds when, working within a faith community or, first responders or kind of these close-knit communities, and not really thinking about, okay, how might my clients know one another? That could get messy, and being able to be mindful of that. And I'm not saying you can never do it, but really thinking through that ethical decision-making of how could this go wrong? Or if it does present it as a conflict, how am I going to address it? I think that's one of the biggest ones are the conflicts of interest.
That example stands out to me because my hairstylist long term said recently, oh, the person coming in before you is so-and-so, and the person coming in after is so-and-so. You know them all. Isn't that funny? And then she stopped and she thought, well, I guess it's not that funny because that's how a client list works. And
Yeah.
I was thinking it's interesting that ours don't. And in some ways, you can see how it happens because it's a barrier for filling a caseload if you can't accept the variety of referrals that you receive due to conflicts of interest.
And I think that kind of, one thing, because I work with a lot of practice owners or people, just launching practices or wanting to scale. And I think along with that, I always say the advice I'm going to give you is very different than what your business coach is giving you. Because most business coaches, right, are operating under kind of this model that fits most fields, right? And so, they want you to get Google reviews from your clients and solicit testimonials and, right, refer your best friends and give discounts on, kickbacks for referral and all of these things that work in other worlds. And our world is just so different. And so I don't think clinicians necessarily think about that, especially when they're getting feedback from others. No, this is how you grow. This is how you scale.
Yeah, and one challenge of that is that I think we've seen people go around this by calling themselves different names. I think it is something that our field is going to have to reckon with, that we've got other people in the community that are not licensed or not eligible for licensure because their discipline is different, that are maybe starting to try and do some of this work, but without the knowledge of trauma, of ethics, of safety that we do have.
Clients and the public don't necessarily know the difference, right? And so they don't realize how they're even more vulnerable or, susceptible to potential, harm when somebody isn't licensed and providing services that maybe straddle that line or come close to it. And I hear a lot of clinicians, think about that, like, well, I don't have as much red tape if I switch and offer this type of service. I say, well, I think just as much as there's a curse to being regulated, there's a blessing to being regulated as well, right? Like, that speaks to your credibility that, right? You have this credential because you have worked hard and earned this credential. And regulations are also there to set standards of practice. So if you're in some of these other unregulated fields and a client wants to sue you, well, that's a whole different world that doesn't have a structure, right? Whereas at least if you come in front of the board has a structure. We've got a code of ethics. We've got all of these standards that oftentimes can actually save a clinician, right? When the board can say, oh, no, they were operating exactly how they should have. Whereas in some of these other fields, you might be, as a professional.
Wow. Have you seen that happen where following our ethics and following the board standards has actually allowed a defense for somebody who's in a lawsuit?
Absolutely. Yep. Because that's what the judges are going to look like at, is the standard of practices, right? And so
Yeah.
if you're able to demonstrate, well, look, my social work code of ethics or whatever it may be really outlines this process, and I utilize an ethical decision-making model, which is, right, what we're supposed to do in our field. It's a lot easier for a judge or the board or someone to look at it and say, oh no, you were absolutely working within your scope and operating ethically. Whereas if we don't have standards for a profession and somebody is suing you, it's a little bit harder for a judge or somebody to look and say, okay, what should have been the expectation?
Oh, that's so interesting. I hadn't ever considered that piece. You're right, though, being able to clearly explain in our documentation why we chose and the options that we weighed can be the deciding factor in a lot of cases.
Absolutely. That's why I always tell people, I can't promise that it will alleviate all liability or responsibility, but it at least demonstrates your due diligence that A, you recognize there was an ethical dilemma and thought through it, right? And can support the path you took. Again, it may not alleviate all responsibility, but it sure as heck can minimize, or reduce it. And it demonstrates that you were an intentional clinician and not just, right, taking chances.
Yeah. Where do you see trends in our field going? What shifts do you imagine happening over the next 10 years or so from this perspective?
Phew. Well, I think so. If I put the regulator hat on, right, I think one of my concerns from that standpoint is our field is expanding so much in terms of modalities, methods, right? You look at, right, integrated whole person approaches now, which is great. And there's a lot of research and literature to support it. But I think we've got to figure out, how does regulation catch up with that? Right. So, if we've said, to not put your hands on your clients, not touch your clients, and now we're moving into somatic experiencing, which may involve some of that, how do we regulate it and do it in a way that's ethical, doesn't risk harm to clients, right? But gives the field the chance to evolve, right? Because there's so many upcoming modalities. So I think we're going to see a shift of, like, what does behavioral health in that world look like when we're integrating healthcare and that mind-body connection? I think that's going to be interesting. more and more people are doing intensives. So we're not doing 50-minute sessions anymore. So what do these longer intensive types of treatment look like, and how might that change the dynamic in our field? Social media continues to be interesting. And what constitutes a therapeutic relationship? If we start offering some online classes and engaging with people in that way, does that start to constitute a therapeutic relationship? And then artificial intelligence obviously is going to be a huge factor.
Uh,
It's a slippery slope of, providing support, maybe in education, but where does that cross the line into psychotherapy?
mhm.
And so if you're offering those types of things or engaging with clients in that manner, being mindful of how that could turn into a potential, right, snowball effect of, does this constitute a therapy relationship, right? Do you have obligations to these people, or are you being really clear about the services you're providing and drawing really clear lines between psychotherapy and some other services?
Those are all really important. I've seen people that aren't clear about their level of licensure that are showing up on social media as an expert. And I think, to your point, simply discerning what is appropriate to be offering in that setting, or what feels like psychotherapy versus a marketing tool or a way to connect with a
Mhm.
potential client. So how to really discern between what those two things look like. And to your point earlier, it might also entail not accepting all the feedback that you're getting from different professions too. They're very, very good at the role that they offer in terms of getting more clients, and some of the feedback that they might be giving wouldn't be appropriate for a clinician using social media.
The work we do. And with social media and marketing and just all of the things that go into that, I tell clinicians we've got to think beyond our intention, right? And sometimes we've got to zoom out and what's the perception of the public, right? So for some of our most vulnerable potential clients, right, being able to engage with you or see you live stream right every day, to them, they start to think that this is a relationship, right? And so when they comment on something and you send a response, do they think now Lorain's my therapist, right? What is
Mm-hmm.
the interpretation of those that are engaging with you too? That's where the potential harm comes from. And it's not always the intended harm, to your point earlier, but just where could these things go wrong for people that are vulnerable?
And that feels like a clear link into what you were saying about AI, that to be able to access a response whenever you need it, and to feel like in some ways it really sees you, like
Mm.
it's saying, wow, Lorain, that was a great question. You really thought that through. That can feel more validating than a lot of folks can access in
Mm.
another setting with a real human for whatever reason.
Absolutely. That's one thing I'm talking to clinicians more and more about. Is I think one thing we should all be doing with clients, regardless of who the client is part of our treatment should be helping them build up those natural supports and
Mm,
connections, right? Because they latch on to therapists sometimes because they don't have that anywhere else, right? We might be the only
mhm.
secure supportive attachment. The same with online platforms and with AI, right? They develop that what they see as a meaningful connection. So I think one of the best things we can do for clients across the board is, in addition to whatever your treatment goals are, how are we building up those natural supports, so they don't feel like the therapist is the only one they can call in the middle of the night, and they're not turning to something that could be potentially, harmful or not give them what they need in the long run.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Uh, you stay pretty up to date on the compacts that
Yes.
are in legislation and potentially coming out. Do you see those having an effect on shifts in our field?
I I think they could open up some more flexibility for business owners, right? If you look at practice owners or, agencies, companies, right, that offer behavioral health services, it's
Mm,
going to open up their market, obviously, if they can employ, counselors or social workers, that can then practice across state lines, right? So now my practice not only can market in Arizona, but I can market in, whatever those other states are. So I think it could help build practices and entities. The flip side of that is it comes into other markets, right? So does my Arizona market start to suffer because now more people or larger companies can do that, right? So I think it could cut both ways. For some clients, a certain subsection of clients that are traveling, right? Like truck drivers, traveling nurses, right? Or those, students that, come and go.
Mm-hmm.
I think for clients, it could open up some more pathways for support because they're able to see clinicians that are licensed in multiple jurisdictions now versus, being so siloed. So I do think there's going to be some shifts. I'm interested to see what it looks like financially, if it's advantageous for clinicians.
Yeah. I always wonder if we're going to see a shift in the need to specialize
Mm.
rather than being a generalist. If the clinicians are going to benefit from really dialing into a particular specialty,
Yeah.
um, as people are able to travel essentially and see, they could,
Seek you out.
yeah, they could seek
Mhm.
out the specific person that they want to work with in the United States versus how it used to be at the beginning of my career. It was like you saw who was available to you from a car ride perspective.
Yeah. No, I think absolutely that might shift, how you sell yourself or how you build up your credibility. Absolutely. I always get worried about clinicians doing that too much. And then what happens if you get bored or, something that you throw yourself into now isn't, right, the modality of choice 10 years from now. And so I think that specialty piece too, I think it could be really beneficial, but also keeping your eyes open so that you don't pigeonhole yourself. Or even, choosing your modality in a way that can be applied across various populations, right? So one or the other where it's not so narrowly focused. I look at that with EFT, right? Like EFT, we used to be looking just at couples and now we use it for families. And now, there's the individual component. And so I think there's things like that where, yeah, how do you continue to diversify, but you do have, right, some expertise.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good example. And then do you imagine shifts in supervision happening as the compacts take effect?
I think it's going to be really interesting for social work, right? So my understanding, the way that they're designed right now, the compact is only for the highest level of licensure. So in Arizona, LPCs, right? The independent level. So supervision, that won't play a role with that compact. The social work compact is, my understanding, being designed for 3 tiers of licensure. And so that's gonna be interesting
Oh,
to see, okay, so, yeah, what does supervision look like? Is it you comply with the supervision within your home state, and as your home state license advances, the other ones do automatically with it, or will there be some kind of streamline of supervision expectations across compact states? I don't know. It'll be interesting. So counseling, I don't think it's going to be a factor, but social work, it'll definitely be interesting with the different tiers. And social work is still about a year behind counseling, so there's a lot I think to have on the radar and watch as that develops.
oh, interesting.
Mhm.
There is fall 2026 what they're saying for the counseling or social work?
Social work. So counseling
Oh, okay.
should be, we're recording on September 3rd. Tomorrow, September 4th, there's NBCC, I think it is putting on a counseling compact update. But the last one I heard was sometime in the next couple of months, counseling compact will go live. And I think sounds like Arizona will be one of the first states. And then, yeah, social work will be about a year behind. So we'd be looking at fall 2026.
Wow, that's exciting.
It is. It's
Um,
cool to see it start to come together.
yeah, I bet it is. I know you've done some work and planning around some of that, haven't you?
So I've been part of a lot of the meetings, and update meetings, but I've had the opportunity to go to a lot of national regulatory conferences, both when I was serving on the board and now as a trainer and presenter. And so the national regulatory conferences are really cool because you get boards from all different states, Virgin Islands, Guam, and everybody does things a little bit different. But it's interesting to see that that's where a lot of these conversations are happening about how do we bridge this gap in the compacts, something that's come from those conferences, and now to see The last one I was at, we actually got to test the counseling one. We got to log in and see what it would be like to request the privilege. So it's been really cool to be involved in kind of those meetings.
Yeah. On the topic of supervision, I think it could be said that supervision trends have shifted since
Sure.
the beginning of our careers. What have you seen that look like?
Yeah, I think we're putting a lot more emphasis on relational supervision, and the relationship between supervisor and supervisee versus more competence and kind of skill teaching, which I think is a good shift. I don't think this is specific to Arizona. I think this is across the board. Uh, I think we don't take care of supervisors, and supervisors are just like clinicians, right? Get compassion fatigue and burnout and are overwhelmed. I think we're starting to see more of that in supervisors, because they're not getting the support, and maybe we're expecting more out of them. So I think that's a concerning trend. But I definitely think that we've shifted more to the relational component and seeing how important that kind of mentorship can be, for a clinician versus just kind of that teaching role.
Hmm. Yeah. And even um, for me, it's like the teaching versus just the ethical
Hmm.
components. I think where a lot of folks started in the past in community mental health, there was such a focus, and there still is in that domain on um, regulations that come
Hmm.
down from the state through the behavioral health provider, et cetera, that
Sure.
even some people would say there wasn't an opportunity for a lot of that teaching and training, let alone what you're saying about the relational component.
Box, right? We went over these things we had to go over, check the box for our hour, and then, yep.
Yeah. On that note, um, do you recommend that people separate those two? They separate the checking the boxes from the admin perspective from the clinical supervision hour?
I do. I really do. I think it helps supervisees know what to expect. I think it helps supervisees feel more comfortable. And I think as a supervisor, it can help us balance those two if we have some really concentrated times and types of meetings. Um, and there's some overlap, right? Like when we talk about clinical documentation or, some things that can cross admin and clinical supervision. But for the most part, I've found if you can keep that administrative, right? If we're talking about scheduling, productivity, those kinds of things, that's one meeting and we can contain that, right? And then when you walk in here, it's clinical supervision, which is really that comprehensive taking care of you as a clinician and helping you grow, and looking more at your work with clients. I just think that has a different feel for everybody involved.
Yeah. How have you seen people, just from a application standpoint,
Yeah.
have you seen any really good ways of scheduling or discerning the two?
Yeah, so I think it starts with setting the tone, which I always say, like laying that foundation for the supervisory relationship so important. And so, how do we really clearly define that in the beginning, right? How does my supervisee understand this is kind of the administrative, this is the task oriented, right? Oversight that I have. And here's what clinical supervision is, right? And so, laying the foundation to first just be able to, are we both looking at it and defining it the same way is really important. And then I really do believe in that separation of time and space. So I'm going to schedule a 30-minute admin meeting every other week or whatever it is. And that's really when we're talking about the task stuff. We have clinical supervision 1 hour every week. And that's where we're talking about clinical supervision. And then as a supervisor, you've got to take lead on that, right? So you can't then start to blur that line or they're not going to know what to expect. But if they come in on a clinical supervision meeting, your supervisee, and they want to start talking about productivity, you say, you know what, I really want you to hold that for our admin meeting, right? You're modeling for them, like, no, in this hour, I want to be there for you as a clinical supervisor. And then training yourself to do that. What I've heard and seen is supervisees come into clinical supervision with a different kind of feel, right? Like, I'm not on guard that you're going to, question me about how many clients I scheduled last week. You're going to be with me about the clients that I want. to staff or the, clinical themes that come up. And that doesn't change, right? That you still have a responsibility and obligation over here administratively. But I think it does change that feel in those meetings. And I think you get a lot more out of your supervisees as a clinical supervisor when you can be with them in that way.
Yeah, I love to hear that. I think that really probably is the expectation of schools with their interns. It probably really is the expectation with the board when it comes to those hours as well. That part isn't clearly spelled out, but it feels like the essence of some of those hourly requirements.
Well, and I think in community mental health or some agency settings, right, the supervisors are getting it from the higher ups, right? And so they're expected to report back on all these administrative things. And so, well, I'm going to loop that into my next meeting. And so it's kind of expected there. And then as practice owners, right, like you've got to check in on what's happening with your practice. And so it's easy to then wear that business hat into some of those meetings. And so I get how it happens, but imagine a world where we could create some separation.
Yeah.
Yeah, and 100 hours of clinical supervision, if you start spending 10 minutes a meeting, right, kind of blurring that line into administrative tasks, how much supervision are they losing out on then?
To that point of how easily it can happen. Time is money too, and
Right?
so I'm sure you've had that in working with business owners and agencies that when you start to say, add another meeting, that's out another hour or half an hour where two people now aren't seeing a client, and so I can imagine where that challenge comes from.
And my advocacy is hopefully both are more productive if we do it that way, right? And so, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
you're right. It's an extra meeting. But if my supervisee feels more supported, maybe they see 4 more clients next week, right? Or they show up in a different way. And maybe the admin tasks start to come together and they become more productive because we're focusing on this and creating those patterns. And so my hope is it is a cost, but in the long run, right, that return on investment's there.
Yeah. I think it really gives an opportunity for someone who may not shine in one area to have a whole meeting where they could. Sometimes I think in our field, I don't know sports at all, so I'm probably going to fumble this analogy,
I see
but
what you did there.
yeah, thank you. Thank you. So you see different types of gymnasts in the Olympics. You can have a graceful Olympian who excels, just as you can have a really athletic gymnast who runs really fast or jumps really high, and both can be excellent. And I think sometimes in our field, we conflate great administratively with great clinicians, and I like to imagine that there can be a lot of different types that can be excellent, so having a half an hour to really brainstorm how to make this effective for you could allow you to improve there, but also allow you a whole hour to really flourish in your clinical supervision and really be given some encouragement to keep growing and keep leaning into this huge strength.
I agree. Well, and the more that I learn, right, in terms of neurodiversity, neurodivergence, and see a lot of the clinicians, right, where administrative tasks aren't their strong suit, is correlated with that. And so if we have that 30-minute meeting dedicated to find systems and processes that will help support them in that area, right? They're going to step up and be able to perform like we want them to, and they're not feeling like their clinical performance is overshadowed by not being so great in that area.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's so important and easy to overlook in a model where it's all covered at the same time, like you're saying. When you're working with supervisees or just talking to them or just training them, what are some things that you challenge or encourage them to look for in a supervisor?
Great question. You know, what I really try to encourage, first is just the belief that they should be interviewing a supervisor just as much as they're feeling interviewed by a supervisor, and that quality supervisors are actually going to appreciate that, right? And so helping them know that they have a voice and being able to ask for what they need or advocate for what they need or they're looking for, is first, I think, just having them develop that confidence in that. I want to talk about their experience, right? Like, has your supervisor worked in settings that are similar to where you work in or want to work in? Have they worked with populations that interest you or modalities, right? How do you align clinically, so that you're going to be getting support that um, that you want? I love the question about, what they think their greatest area of growth is as a supervisor, because you can learn a lot from somebody if you ask them their greatest area of growth. So I think when a supervisee can ask that, their intention, why they like to provide supervision or why they're providing supervision, can shed some light on certain things. Um, Supervisees asking, what makes for a good supervisee, I think can be a good question too, to understand your supervisor's expectations. Maybe the supervisor's experience with being a supervisee, putting them back in that seat. But I think the aligning in terms of goodness of fit clinically, right, in terms of population, setting, modalities is key. And then just getting a feel for the personalities, right? You need to find somebody that you feel like you can be vulnerable with, right? Supervisors are not therapists, but they're supporting you in a whole nother way that requires that human to human connection. The availability piece, I think, is huge, right? If my supervisor is only available for the 1 hour we're supposed to be meeting each week, and I'm a newer clinician, newer supervisee, that might be concerning to me, right? Where's my safety net if something comes up in between meetings? So those are some key things. The biggest things that I hear from supervisees, availability and approachability are the two things they're really looking for. And so it's how do you find questions to explore that?
Hmm. Do you hear concerns about supervisors that don't keep accurate notes or don't keep accurate files or things like that?
Yeah, and that's a great point. I think sometimes asking, how many people have they seen through licensure can be a good question too, just knowing how much experience they have with that process and with compliance. I think it's really heartbreaking how many supervisees I've seen lose out on hours because a supervisor wasn't compliant with documentation or some of the logistical things that go along with supervision. Um, and so part of that, I think, is also empowering supervisees, especially even at the intern level. Like we're doing an event in 2 weeks, a free intern and a new associate event where I go over my associate training, which goes over all of the licensure requirements, empowering our associates to know what they need so they're not just blindly following a supervisor and can say, right, oh, I thought we needed to sign this supervision note within 10 days. How are we going to do that, right? Being able to ask the right questions. And then helping supervisors be open to that, right? Like, how do we not just assume we know it all? And if our supervisee is bringing a concern, then how are we seeking consultation to make sure, yeah, we are doing it right? We're crossing our T's and dotting our I's. And I tell supervisees, you've got a really difficult decision to make if you're not getting what you need, right? Or it's on your radar that something's not in compliance. Is that a relationship you want to continue? And I know that can be a really difficult choice when you just want a job and you want to get your hours and you want to work, but supervisor relationship is so important. For me, I would rather see them find that good fit and maybe lose some time and hours, than stay with a supervisor that may not be a good fit or may not be in compliance.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. From that relational perspective that you were talking about earlier, what strategies have you seen supervisors implement or that you implement yourself in your supervisor relationships that help that foster that relational piece?
Oh. Yeah, I truly believe it. So it's easy. It's always been easy, I feel like, for me to do, but from the beginning, I let them know, like, you are a human to me before you're a supervisee, right? Like, that is just so important. And at the end of the day, like, I want to help you figure out who you want to be professionally and hold that gently, versus trying to pigeonhole you into being just like me or to doing this or whatever it may be. So I try to lay the foundation from the beginning, just like you're human. Um, I use personal disclosure just like I do with clients, right? It's intentional and I think it's helpful because I want my supervisees to see me as human as well. And then I'm just very transparent about, I have high expectations, and especially when it comes to ethics, and that's to keep you safe, your client safe, and me safe. In every other kind of realm, clinically, like, I'm going to let you figure it out. Do what you want to do, right? And let's talk about it. So I just think it goes a long way to show that care and concern from the human standpoint, but also showing them that I am going to hold them to a high standard, right? And I think that's the feedback I've gotten from supervisees, is that good balance between being flexible, right, and approachable and supporting them, and also mentoring this high standard and ways of doing things to keep themselves and their clients protected. I try not to be all business all the time, which is hard for some people to believe if they've been to my trainings. But I do find ways to soften and engage so that, I use humor a lot. And that's the other thing. And there are very few things that have come up in my career that we couldn't address, right? And take care of. So, like, bring it to me, we'll figure it out together.
Great. When do you suggest for people to reach out to their malpractice insurance for another layer of consultation? Like what types of situations for someone who may have never done that before, when could that be a useful tool?
That's great. So first of all, I always tell people, have your own, right? So supervisors have their own, supervisees have their own. I don't care if the entity you work for has, a compliance department or insurance. Always have your own, so you have that option. For me, some of the key areas, are client records, right? Clients and client guardians, have pretty much unrestricted access to client records. And if you feel like there's something in there that, you want to protect, especially if you think it's a safety concern, I think reaching out to your liability insurance just to cover yourself, because denying somebody or somebody's guardian their record could have huge consequences. And so that's a key one. If you're being requested to testify, all right. That's something outside of our general scope of services. So I think seeking malpractice insurance about, can you show up? Should you show up? And if you do, what can we speak to? I think those are really helpful. Disgruntled clients, right? If there's somebody, threatening, right, your practice, harassing your practice, threatening, board complaints, that might be another time where you want to seek either professional consultation or liability insurance. Those are probably the big ones. Records and testifying.
Yeah, those are good things to keep in mind. This could be a whole conversation on its own, but
can do another one.
Yeah, great. You're my co-host now.
I like it.
In terms of documenting critical incidents, could you just give a little bit of an overview on how that could benefit someone to separately keep a log of those?
Absolutely. And, agencies have done critical incident reports for a long time. And I mean, I just remember when I started, we had to. And so critical incident reports, the way that I describe them, is they're internal documents, right, for the protection of the entity or the clinician. It's the behind the scenes kind of stuff. Obviously, in your client record, you're documenting, right, your sessions, the nature of the sessions, and our documentation justifies that we're providing appropriate services. But if there's anything behind the scenes that could be detrimental to the client to have on the record, or present a safety concern, or just isn't necessarily clinically relevant, but is important for you to document just for your own protection, then I would use a critical incident report. And you want to keep them safeguarded, especially if you're using any client identifying information. But it's essentially a breakdown of what you're doing behind the scenes, right? And so, I sometimes will use the example of a client gets hurt in your waiting room. Mm-hmm. You offer, right, medical services, you offer whatever, and they decline it. Okay. I'm going to write up a critical incident report. This happened. It's not clinically relevant. But I want to just note that this happened right? And the client goes and wants to sue you for whatever happened in the waiting room. You're not opening up their entire client record and sensitive details about their clinical services to try and defend yourself, right? You've got a critical incident report from that day. This is what transpired. I suggest for DCS calls. A lot of the information that we document or should be documenting during a DCS call, a mandated reporting call, isn't appropriate for the client record. If it could put the child in more danger or anybody in more danger, if it could disrupt an investigation, right? And so I like to put those in critical incident reports. If there's ever a complaint, Lorain didn't call DCS, you've got the critical incident report that you can release to demonstrate you did your due diligence. Again, it's not living in the client record where it could compromise something or be concerning. So I think about it as something that internal, for the entity or the clinician protection that really documents that behind the scenes stuff. You're trying to figure out, do you refer a client out because of either not goodness of fit or whatever it is? You seek consultation with me. You're going through an ethical decision-making process. You don't want all those details in the client record. The discussion you're having with the client and the referrals you give and all of that you want in the client record. But the behind the scenes stuff, right? You want that just in case it ever comes back and Lorain abandoned me. Well, no, this was a really intentional decision. Here's how I got there. So those are the types of things that I think they can be really helpful for.
And can you explain some of the ideas you have on how to store those?
Yeah, so I mean, back in the day, old school, we used to just keep paper copies and we put them in a locked file cabinet, which I am still a proponent of that.
Yeah.
You can do, a locked Word document or a protected document, on your device. What I'm seeing more and more practices do is create a critical incident client or file in their EHR system and then uploading the critical incidents all there so they know they're safeguarded, they're secure, they're in, or on that platform and preserved, but they're not living in the actual client records. So those are some things that you can do.
I love that. I love that idea of having a critical incident client.
Mm-hmm.
What are some resources that you have either for, and if you don't mind distinguishing between that Arizona people can access versus people elsewhere could access and benefit from?
So like clinician resources?
Yep.
Yeah. So those in Arizona, obviously, I do consultations. I've done some out of state, but I do a lot of ethical consultations for clinicians here in Arizona. If you have regulatory questions, things of that nature, a lot of the associations or, to your point about malpractice insurance, a lot of those entities will have some support ethically too, whether it's an ethics hotline or some sort of support ethically. So, clinicians everywhere, I feel like looking into those resources. If you're a member of AMFT or NASW, what resources are available to you through those organizations can be really helpful. I have a conference coming up in April for clinicians, which is not your typical therapist conference. That will be open to those who are in Arizona and who want to travel. I have found that NBCC puts on a lot of great CE events. Some are free to the public. You don't even have to be necessarily a licensed counselor, but just those of us in the behavioral health profession. So I encourage people to check out those continuing education opportunities through NBCC. NBCC keeps a calendar of all NBCC approved trainings. So you can find providers and trainings in various states, in person, online, that can be good support. So I encourage people to look there too for continuing education information.
Awesome. And then your clinician or your supervisor groups and your upcoming retreats, would those be open to those outside of Arizona?
Yes, so I have the supervisor consultation groups. I've had a couple people out of state participate, and they've found them helpful, but they are heavy on Arizona regulations. So I do have multiple consultation groups, and so if anybody out of state's interested, I would just say reach out to me and we can see what group might be a good fit. But yes, I have multiple supervisor consultation groups. January 2026, I have a behavioral health business owner retreat. And so that will be for, practice owners, and it'll be, looking at kind of the business piece, but also taking care of the ethics piece. And that'll be open to to clinicians everywhere. And then the June retreat, June, I have a 6-hour refresher for Arizona supervisors. So that one will be Arizona specific, that retreat. And then the end of next year, November 2026, I have a retreat that'll be self-care and supervision. So that'll be open to supervisors from anywhere.
A perfect segue. Thank you for the teeing up such a great pitch for me. What are some techniques and things, as you've been talking about supervisors and their self-care and keeping their morale up and just what you've seen, what are some strategies or suggestions that you might make to someone who wants to further their self-care?
Yeah. Support system is one of the greatest things we can do for ourselves as supervisors. And I always say you should have 2 groups of support. You should have a group of other supervisors who get it and are there for you when things are difficult. And then you should have a group of people that don't even know what you do for a living that offer a different kind of support, right? When you want to kind of escape that world. So I think that's really important. But realizing providing clinical supervision, it's a whole nother world. And so being able to have support, don't just, what I have found with supervisors, we just add to our plate and we don't think about what we might need to take off of our plate. If you're adding 3 supervisees this year, well, where does that time and energy come from, right? So you've got to think about what else do you let go. But I think that support piece is the biggest. How do you build up your network, your resources? So many supervisors feel like I have to know it all. I have to have all of the answers and I have to do it on my own. And I say, you don't have to know it all. You should have resources that you can turn to, right? But being able to shoulder that, I think, lends to the longevity. And then you know what worked for you as a clinician, right? And so if there were things, if your morning routine is really important to you as a clinician, don't let that go because you're a supervisor now and you want to add a meeting in the morning, right? Like what do you need to hold on to for you?
Yeah, great feedback. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that would be important for us to cover in the context of our topics today?
Just one thing that I have been, I think, just putting differently lately, the more that I talk about supervision, both to supervisees and to supervisors, is I think for so long the emphasis has been on getting licensed. And so I've really been trying to shift people to think about supervision isn't about getting licensed. Licensed is a great perk at the end of it, right? And that's what we're working towards. But the whole point of clinical supervision is really developing, right? Professional growth and development. And so if we start looking at it from that context, the hours and everything will come. But if we look at it as like, we're just doing this until I get licensed or until you get licensed, it takes on a whole different meaning. And so I think looking at supervision, especially as it's about professional growth and development, licensure comes with that, and that's great. And the other thing I think as we talk about, what do we do, for ourselves as clinicians and supervisors, is really thinking about how can you grow and not just do the same old, same old. I think we get really complacent. That's where I see people end up in front of the board, right? We get complacent, so we find the easiest ethics training to click through. We're not getting anything out of it. Another consultation group, that would be an extra hour each month. I can't do that, so I'm going to let that go. And you just get isolated doing the same old, same old. So push yourself, challenge yourself.
I love that. That resonates so much for me too. I think that's a great reminder. Then, I mean, in the licensure example, you get it and then you drop off, if that was the only
Yep.
goal, and then you might look up 10 years down the road and you don't know other people working in the field. You aren't aware of new research. You may not have anything that excites you that you could be implementing in your sessions. I mean, but if your lens is to continue with learning and seeking out great information and, all of that stuff, then that continues. That's a lifelong search.
Absolutely. And that's what I love. I mean, I right now have 6 supervisor independent license consultation groups, and it is just so cool to see people at that level wanting to do that.
Yeah. Showing up late and wanting to learn.
Just my advanced group, just you guys.
Okay, well, this was so fun. Thank you so much for your
Thank
time. I always
you.
love to learn from you.
Yeah,
And
thank you.
Where can people find you if they want to check out some of the things we've talked about today?
Absolutely. So clinicalbestpracticeinstitute.com is my website. They can email info@clinicalbestpracticeinstitute.com if they want to reach me. And then cbpievents.com is my event website with the conference and retreat information too.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Self-Carapist podcast. If you did, please subscribe and feel free to leave a review. You can also follow along at the Self-Carapist on Instagram or head to lorainmoorehead.com/podcast to grab a free copy of your own learning map worksheet to help track all of the tools and strategies you're interested in learning more about. See you next Wednesday.